She stood up, glass in hand, and screamed, "I was nothing loud enough to silence the whole vineyard." Funny thing, not 5 minutes earlier, her fiancé called me Judge Hayes in front of everyone. If you've ever been erased by your own family, only to be recognized by a stranger in a room full of people who pretended you didn't exist, stay with me. This story isn't just about revenge, it's about what happens when dignity speaks louder than blood. Welcome to our channel where real stories come to life with heart, depth, and meaning. Thank you for clicking on this video and spending your time with us. I invite you to stay until the very end, because today's story isn't just emotional, it might just change the way you think about love, family, and what it means to truly belong. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was thick pearlescent with no return address, and only 2 words typed on the front in neat, lifeless font, Miss Hayes. Danielle held it between 2 fingers, staring at it like it might explode. She already knew what it was: her sister's wedding. What struck her wasn't the contents, it was the careful omission. No Danielle, no Judge Hayes. Just a generic courtesy, a placeholder for someone they barely acknowledged anymore. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she set it on the corner of her kitchen table, beside an unopened water bill and a framed photo of her old dog Jasper. The photo at least felt honest. Jasper never once made her feel unwanted. That evening, after feeding herself a modest dinner of roasted vegetables and pouring a glass of red wine, Danielle returned to the envelope. She opened it with the side of her thumb slowly, precisely, like she used to turn legal briefs in court. Inside was the invitation: Rachel Elaine Hayes and James Bennett Green cordially invite you to share in their joy. There was no mention of her name, not even buried in the body of the text. Just a folded cream-colored card tucked inside in her mother's looping cursive: "Please don't ruin her day. Just stay away." Elaine Danielle stared at the card long enough for the wine in her hand to lose its warmth. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. One she had been handed long ago, but never fully accepted. The silence from her family hadn't started with Rachel's engagement. It began 10 years earlier, the night she testified in a sexual misconduct case involving a prominent businessman from their town, Robert Mercer, a man who used to play piano at Christmas gatherings and send birthday cards to the Hayes children until they were too old to matter. Danielle had taken the stand with a spine full of steel and hands that didn't shake. The victim was her student mentee. Mercer had harassed her for months. When it escalated, Danielle pushed for charges and offered to testify to a pattern of behavior she had once observed herself quietly and uncomfortably years before. Elaine's response had been swift, cold, and unwavering. "We don't drag men like that through court, Danielle. You should have come to us. A lady doesn't expose family friends, not publicly." Danielle had opened her mouth to speak, but Elaine was already walking away, her heeled steps crisp against the porch wood. "Don't call again," her mother had added. "You've made your choice." Danielle had made her choice. And 10 years later, she stood in the echo of that moment, her mother's words etched not just in memory, but now on embossed cardstock. She placed the letter on the counter and walked into her study, the one lined with degrees and commendations no one in her family had ever acknowledged. On the wall hung her North Carolina Bar Association Award for Judicial Integrity. Below it, a filing cabinet housed unopened letters, legal pads filled with arguments, and a navy box she hadn't touched in years. Inside the box, nestled in blue velvet, was the silver judicial pin from her first swearing-in handed to her by Justice Evelyn Carter, the woman who had mentored Danielle when she was the only Black woman in her graduating class to pursue constitutional law. Danielle had kept every letter Evelyn had ever sent her, but one stood out folded neatly, and resting atop the others yellowed, just slightly with time. "Silence isn't peace, Danielle. Some legacies are written without ink." It had arrived the year after the tribunal hearings, when Danielle was passed over for a federal seat she was more than qualified for. The board hadn't said why. They never had to. Her courtroom ethics had been pristine. Her problem was less tangible, too sharp, too vocal, hard to place. She reread Evelyn's letter slowly, letting the words settle like dust in sunlight. Silence wasn't peace. It had never been. She had been silent long enough. Danielle walked back into the kitchen, picked up the card from Elaine, and held it over the sink. She didn't tear it. She didn't burn it. She simply let it fall into the basin as if it had never existed, just like her place in the family. They could keep the photo albums with her face cropped out. They could host elegant rehearsals and curated Instagram stories, but they couldn't erase what she'd done. The young woman she helped had graduated law school last spring. 2 wrongful conviction cases Danielle had reopened were now cited in casebooks. They could pretend she hadn't lived. But justice remembered. And Danielle Hayes was still here. The vineyard sat just outside Asheville, tucked between rows of dogwood trees and manicured gravel paths that whispered of curated wealth. Lanterns hung from the vines like suspended stars, casting a soft, expensive glow over the converted barn, now reimagined as a reception hall. Every detail looked borrowed from a wedding magazine. White roses arranged in perfect, unassuming symmetry, long farmhouse tables softened with eucalyptus runners, champagne chilling in polished silver. Danielle stepped out of her car in a navy suit that fit like a second skin. Nothing flashy, just clean lines and quiet tailoring. No tie. A cream blouse with a shallow neckline. Her shoes clicked against the stone walkway with the grace of someone who had walked into countless rooms where her presence was both necessary and unwanted. At the entrance, a woman in a headset greeted her without recognition. "Are you with the Green Party or the Hayes family?" Danielle blinked. "Yes," she said simply and moved past. Inside, the seating chart was displayed on a wooden easel framed in gold. Names etched in looping cursive were organized by table and roll bride's family, groom's law colleagues, college friends. She scanned the list. There was no Danielle Hayes, not even a D. Hayes, just row after row of relatives, some she hadn't seen since childhood, others she suspected wouldn't recognize her even if she stood beside their car. She kept her expression neutral and made her way to the long central table where a server motioned her toward a single empty seat. A folded cream card rested atop the dinner plate blank. No calligraphy, no ink. Just thick cardstock with a pristine crease like someone had forgotten or chosen not to write her name at all. Danielle touched it gently with her fingertips. The paper held no weight, but the moment did. She sat spine straight, hands resting lightly in her lap. Around her, conversation ebbed and swelled like water around a stone. The people beside her didn't acknowledge her. Across the table, an aunt, she vaguely remembered, raised her eyebrows, whispered something into a cousin's ear, then quickly looked away. "Who is that woman?" the cousin murmured. "No idea," came the reply. "Maybe someone from James's firm." Danielle almost smiled. A waiter approached his tray laden with shrimp cocktails and smoked cheese bites. He paused as he placed a plate in front of her eyes, lingering for a beat too long. "Here you go, miss." He stopped, corrected himself mid-syllable. "Sorry." "Judge Hayes." She met his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. His face flushed as he walked away, balancing his tray a little too carefully. The plate he left held 2 shrimp and a single deviled egg. Small, elegant, absurd. Danielle adjusted the sleeve of her jacket and reached for her glass of water. The cutlery clinked gently around her, the kind of muffled grace only money could buy. Laughter rose and fell at the groom's table, where James leaned in to whisper something to Rachel, who nodded without looking up. Rachel was radiant, flawlessly styled, in a flowing blush gown, her hair curled in loose, effortful ease. She moved from group to group like a hostess in a Southern lifestyle commercial, smiling with teeth that never reached her eyes. She had seen Danielle. That much was certain. But she hadn't looked again. At the far end of the room, Elaine sat composed, her signature pearl brooch pinned neatly on her collarbone. She was dressed in pale lilac, her lipstick precise. Her posture was immaculate, Like someone rehearsing grief for a funeral she had no intention of mourning. She had not acknowledged Danielle either. Danielle studied her wine glass as she slowly turned it in place. She wasn't here for validation. She knew that. She was here because absence would have felt like surrender. Behind her, string lights flickered against the exposed wooden beams. A quartet played softly in the corner, the notes careful and beautiful and forgettable. Outside, the sun slipped behind the hills. Inside, Danielle was a fixture without form, a name, not set a title, not claimed. Until now. Across the room, James stood quietly at the bar, his back straight, his drink untouched. He glanced toward her not once, but twice, and this time he didn't look away. Their eyes met. He nodded. Danielle returned the gesture with the smallest lift of her glass. Nothing theatrical, just enough. Around her, the atmosphere thinned. The room was still full of noise, of course. But for Danielle Hayes, former judge-erased daughter, unwelcome guest, the silence was far more honest than any toast. She sipped the wine slowly. It was too warm, too sweet. But she let it linger on her tongue, the way you do when you know you aren't supposed to enjoy something, but you will anyway. She placed the glass down. Her place card remained blank. But now, the weight of being invisible didn't feel like shame. It felt like control. The dinner had begun to settle into its rhythm. Toasts were underway, first from Rachel's college roommate, then a groomsman, who told a safe, rehearsed story about James fumbling through his first case. The laughter was polite. The wine poured freely. The music floated like ambiance on autopilot. Danielle sipped her glass sparingly, not out of nerves, but out of calculation. She had been in far tenser rooms under harsher light, facing more formidable audiences. Yet nothing compared to the sharp edge of being unwelcome among those who once knew your childhood bedtime. Rachel laughed too easily, nodding along with the speakers, but glancing repeatedly toward the far end of the table where Danielle sat. Their mother Elaine remained still, every inch the southern matriarch. Chin-high brooch, gleaming lips tight with well-practiced elegance. Then James stood. He didn't tap his glass, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, and the room quieted with an ease that spoke of presence, not volume. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, hands resting lightly on the back of Rachel's chair. "Some of you have been part of our journey from the very beginning. Others I'm honored to be getting to know better." He paused, just long enough for the room to lean in. "When I was in law school," he continued, "there was a case I couldn't stop thinking about. It was about tenant rights, boring on the surface but brilliant underneath. Clean, precise, and unexpectedly humane." Danielle tilted her head slightly. A memory stirred. The ruling changed how I thought about law, about people, about what justice really means. I remember thinking, whoever wrote this doesn't just understand the law. They see people. He turned not to the head table, not to Rachel, but to Danielle. The author was listed as Judge D. Hayes. You wouldn't happen to be her, would you? Silence dropped like a gavel. Rachel's hand froze around the stem of her champagne flute. Her knuckles whitened. Elaine's composure faltered just barely. A breath held too long. A glance flickered sideways. Danielle set her glass down gently. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't smooth her jacket, just lifted her eyes to meet James's and replied calm and clear, "You have good taste in legal scholarship." A ripple passed through the table. Chairs stiffened. Forks paused mid-cut. Whispers hovered like suspended dust. Rachel stood. The chair scraped harshly against the wood floor, splitting the moment open. Her voice cracked as she spoke, not loud but sharp, brittle. "She's nothing," Rachel said. "She doesn't belong here." The room inhaled and didn't exhale. All eyes turned. Some in confusion, others in anticipation, like they had waited too long to see what Danielle would say, how the ghost might respond. Danielle didn't look at Rachel. She didn't look at Elaine, who now sat utterly still, jaw clenched. She picked up her glass again, gave it a small, almost ceremonial swirl, and replied, soft, measured, deliberate. Apparently being nothing still gets you published in the Harvard Law Review. It landed not as a retort, but as a reckoning. Somewhere down the table, a fork clinked against porcelain. Someone muttered, "She's a judge." Another voice, "I thought she wasn't invited." Eyes bounced between Danielle and Rachel like a game of silent tennis. Rachel's mouth opened then closed. Her chest rose with a breath that caught halfway. Her lipstick was smudged slightly at the corner, just enough to betray the panic swimming beneath her skin. She reached for her champagne and missed. The glass tipped, spilling onto the white linen like a blush-colored wound. The liquid slid toward the centerpiece, soaking into the eucalyptus leaves. She grabbed a napkin, dabbing with a fury that felt desperate, not delicate. Then she turned and walked out. No apology, no explanation. The string quartet resumed as if someone had pressed play on a paused scene. A cousin leaned into her spouse's shoulder. Elaine bowed her head slightly, as though preparing for a prayer she didn't believe in. James didn't move. He simply looked at Danielle again, a small, barely there smile lifting the corners of his mouth. He raised his glass once more, not to Rachel, not to the room, just to her. She didn't mirror the gesture, but she didn't need to, because in that moment, the room saw her. Not the woman who had been erased from family photographs, not the sister spoken about in past tense, not the name left off invitations, but Judge Danielle Hayes, and she had not raised her voice once. By the time Danielle opened her eyes the next morning, her phone had already buzzed 11 times. 2 voicemails, a handful of unread texts, and one subject line from an anonymous blog that read, "When judges cross the line, a Hayes family expose." She didn't panic. Instead, she turned off the alarm and walked to her kitchen with the same calm she had once used to overrule a courtroom objection. Coffee brewed in silence while her laptop hummed to life. One click opened the flood. Reddit threads speculated she'd been disbarred. A podcast hinted at an ethics investigation involving a female judge with a vendetta. Anonymous sources, clearly not legal professionals, cited vague irregularities in a mistrial from 15 years ago. Her name was everywhere now, framed in suspicion, shrouded in half-truths and digital dirt. The headline that stung most wasn't even the harshest Hayes a judge no more. Danielle stared at the screen, unmoved. This wasn't outrage, it was strategy. And she knew strategy when she saw it. The timing was surgical, less than 12 hours after James called her Judge Hayes in front of the entire family and wedding party. Someone close had waited for the right moment to pull the thread. She leaned back in her chair. Outside, rain tapped gently on the windows of her Raleigh condo. Inside, her silence roared. The phone rang again. "Maya." Danielle answered with a single word. "Morning. I assume you've seen it?" "Of course." There was a pause. Maya's voice, always firm but warm now, had the sharp cadence of a woman both furious and caffeinated. "They're pulling things from blog archives that don't even cite real sources. We've got half-baked commentary, uncredited forums, and exactly one photo of you at a conference in 2009 cropped out of context." Danielle opened her inbox. The smear campaign wasn't elegant, but it had reach. "We respond," she said calmly. "Not with outrage, with fact." Maya exhaled. "God, I love you." By 9:30, Danielle had written a one-page public statement. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't even posted to her own channels. Maya uploaded it quietly to the North Carolina Judicial Transparency Portal, where real people still read real records. No hashtags, no photos, just truth. It read, "The claims currently circulating online regarding my judicial career are not only false, they are recycled accusations long dismissed by the Judicial Ethics Review Board in 2012. I have served with integrity for over 2 decades. My record includes decisions that have exonerated the wrongly convicted protected tenants against unlawful evictions and held public institutions accountable. I welcome scrutiny, but not fiction." Danielle R. Hayes, J.D. At the bottom, in small italic text, she included a quote from Adams, "Facts are stubborn things." The backlash burned out faster than expected, because by noon the stories began to shift. A former clerk posted a photo of Danielle standing beside her at a graduation ceremony in 2018. She told me I didn't need to become loud to be heard. She taught me how to write dissent like it mattered. A mother posted Judge Hayes made my son feel human when he was cuffed and scared. She ruled against us, but she looked me in the eye. That's rare. Even a man she had once sentenced wrote under his real name, "She gave me 5 years." And before the gavel dropped, she said, "You matter beyond this moment. Don't forget that." I didn't. Danielle read each post carefully, slowly, not with pride, but with gratitude. These weren't curated tributes. They were memories, echoes of small moments she hadn't even realized had landed. By evening, major news outlets had backed off. The tabloid-style blogs were buried under community support. One lawyer from the Innocence Project even tagged her in a tweet, "You don't erase a woman like that with gossip. She's part of the reason I practice law." Danielle didn't retweet it. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Elaine's silence rang louder than any headline. Danielle returned to her office and sat in the leather chair she had refused to replace. She looked out the rain-streaked window past the courthouse where she'd once delivered a ruling that had changed precedent in 3 southern states. She thought of Rachel, of her sister's face when James said Judge Hayes, of the panic in her grip, the champagne soaking the tablecloth. The wedding would go on. The photos would be edited. The narrative would be reshaped. But there was one moment no one could delete. Danielle reached into her drawer and pulled out a letter one she'd written to herself 10 years ago but never mailed. A letter titled simply, "In case you forget who you are." She didn't need to read it now. She just placed it atop the others, the ones that said thank you without permission, the ones that didn't ask who she was before they believed in what she stood for. And slowly, deliberately, Danielle smiled. Not because she won, but because they couldn't take her name away anymore. The garden looked like a cathedral carved from air and late spring light. Rows of ivory-covered chairs circled a floral archway, everything curated to suggest intimacy while still reeking of wealth. Roses, soft pink and pale, as dusk adorned the aisle in bunches too perfect to be real, though Danielle could tell they were. That's the difference money makes. It buys silence, even from flowers. Each chair had a name written in careful calligraphy on tags tied with silk ribbons. Except one. Far from the aisle beneath the shadow of a birch tree, there was a single seat with no name. No ribbon, no flourish. Just a folded white linen napkin resting in the center, like a truce. Danielle walked toward it without hesitation. She didn't look left or right. Her heels barely made a sound on the crushed gravel. No one greeted her. A few heads turned. Others didn't bother. Her presence now, after the dinner, after the whispers, wasn't something they knew how to integrate. They hadn't rehearsed this part. She sat crossing one leg over the other, hands calm in her lap. From this distance, she could see the soft outline of Rachel through the archway. Her sister stood still beside James, poised like a statue carved for display, elegant, preserved, untouchable. Elaine sat in the front row, her spine a perfect line of pride. Her pearl earrings shimmered against her skin, but her eyes gave nothing away. Danielle studied the scene as if it were a courtroom decor, trying too hard, smiles held too tight, and a script too rehearsed to be real. The officiant began. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Rachel Hayes and James Green, and to honor the people who helped make this day possible." Names followed like a procession. Elaine, of course. Aunt Melanie, Rachel's college roommate, one groomsman's mother, someone's step-uncle. Danielle's name never came. It didn't surprise her, but it still scraped against something old inside her chest. She didn't blink, didn't shift. She simply listened, as she had learned to, without expectation. Then James stepped forward, his folded speech in hand. His voice low and steady cut through the garden's hum like wind through lace. "I wasn't raised with strong male role models. But in law school, I came across a ruling that reframed everything I thought I knew about justice," he said. He paused, looking around the gathered crowd. It was about tenant rights, systemic bias, equity. But more than anything, it was about seeing people, especially those the system forgets. The author was Judge D. Hayes. Another pause. His eyes found Danielle's. She may not be listed in the program, but without her, I wouldn't be standing here as the man I am. Thank you, Judge Hayes. The crowd murmured, some in confusion, others in appreciation. Rachel didn't move. Her expression didn't falter. But something in her shoulders tensed so slightly, only Danielle noticed. Not defiance, not anger. Recognition. Maybe even regret. And then it happened. Rachel took a breath sharp enough to turn heads, then without a word she stepped down from the altar. She didn't look at James, didn't gesture for the officiant to pause. She walked straight down the aisle, past the rows of guests, past her mother, past the photographers, all the way to Danielle. No one whispered now. Even the birds seemed to quiet. Rachel stopped in front of her, her hands trembling slightly as she held out a small white envelope. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. She simply placed the envelope onto Danielle's lap, turned, and walked back the way she came. Danielle didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly, with a calm that belied the storm inside her, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single photo. Not a note, not a message, just an image. It was from their father's 60th birthday, one of the last full family gatherings before Danielle's public testimony tore the illusion apart. She remembered the original photo well. Rachel mid-laugh, Elaine in pearls, uncles, cousins, and a blank space at the edge of the table where Danielle had stood, hand on Rachel's shoulder. In that version, her face had been cropped, but this copy was different. Here she was there, restored. Not added in, not pasted like an apology, but printed cleanly, like she had always been present. A quiet reversal. A photo edited not for optics, but for memory. Danielle held it delicately, her eyes scanning every face. Hers was softer than she remembered, her smile subtle, but it was hers. She didn't cry, didn't smile either. She just folded the envelope and placed it gently into her jacket pocket near her heart. Rachel never turned around. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. Vows were exchanged, rings placed, promises made. But for Danielle, the moment that mattered most had already passed. Because someone somewhere between shame and memory had decided to remember her. And sometimes that was enough. The hotel ballroom smelled faintly of new carpet-polished brass and too much perfume. Rows of chairs fanned out like spokes toward the podium. Every seat filled even the overflow section near the back. Danielle stood alone in the green room, watching her reflection in the tall mirror. The suit was charcoal gray this time, the kind you wear when you've stopped needing to prove anything. The tie, a deep navy, with a single silver stripe, was straight. Still, she adjusted it. Not out of nervousness, just habit. Some routines remain even after the reasons for them disappear. Behind her, framed portraits of past speakers lined the wall, judges, civil rights leaders, policy reformers. Faces caught mid-thought, mid-decade, mid-mission. Danielle recognized some, had debated others. One face, though, was missing her mentor, Justice Evelyn Carter. But Danielle didn't need the photo. She could hear Evelyn's voice clear as the day she whispered it across a conference table. Some records aren't on paper. They're written in who you become. A knock at the door, then Maya's voice, gentle but firm. "You've got 5. Danielle nodded. Maya lingered. "They added your name to the banner," she said. "First line." Danielle smiled slightly. "I saw it. Took a picture. Didn't post it." Maya's lips curved a knowing half-smile. "Didn't think so." She slipped out, letting the door close softly behind her. Danielle took one last look at herself, at who she had become. Not someone who needed to be remembered, but someone who had chosen never to forget why she started. The room greeted her with applause that wasn't thunderous, but steady, honest. People stood not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. The kind of applause that carries respect, not spectacle. She approached the podium slowly, her heels muted by the carpet, her posture exact. No preamble, no show. She began, I was once told that the law doesn't remember names. It remembers rulings. It remembers consequences. It remembers who showed up when no one asked them to. A beat of silence. She continued. Some of you know me from my tenant rights rulings. Some from my work with the Innocence Project. Others know me only as a footnote in a textbook or a quote in a lecture. Her gaze swept across the room. But today, I want to talk about something the law rarely discusses: memory. Not legal memory, human memory. The kind that defines how we pass down justice not just through precedent, but through presence. Danielle spoke without notes. Her voice held weight, but no anger. Authority without arrogance. Not once did she mention the smear campaign or the years of erasure. She didn't have to. The room already knew. And more importantly, they knew she had shown up anyway. My mentor once said some legacies are written without ink. I believe that. Because sometimes the most meaningful work we do is the kind that never makes the papers. The room held still. Danielle closed her talk with a final sentence, not dramatic but clean. The law sees people, and so must we. The applause was louder this time. It rolled through the room in waves, not just for her words, but for the quiet dignity behind them. She stepped off the stage without waiting for accolades. She had never lingered for fanfare. Near the exit, a young woman approached. Brown curls framed her face, and a badge clipped to her blazer read, Assistant Public Defender, Mecklenburg County. Her voice trembled at the start. Judge Hayes. Danielle nodded. I just wanted to say, your ruling in the Thompson eviction case. Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. It let my client keep her home. But it also let me stay in law school. If we'd lost, I would have had to drop out to help cover the cost. Danielle looked at her. Really looked. She didn't see admiration. She saw grit. She saw late nights. She saw sacrifice layered under ambition. She saw herself 30 years ago. Without a word, Danielle reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out something she hadn't touched in years. A small box. Navy velvet. She opened it. Inside lay her old judicial pin, the one Justice Carter had placed in her hand on the day of her swearing in. The one she hadn't worn since the day her name was scrubbed from the family ledger. Danielle pressed the box into the young woman's hand. Wear it when you forget why you started. The woman's eyes welled. She couldn't speak. Just nodded, clutching the box like it was more than metal, like it was proof she mattered. Danielle smiled, then turned. She didn't stay for the networking hour, didn't pose near the coffee table or wait for someone to ask for a selfie. She stepped outside, heels clicking softly on concrete, her breath meeting the cool air like an old friend. No parade, no headlines, just presence. And somehow, that was enough. The house was quiet, but not hollow. Danielle slipped off her heels at the door and walked barefoot across the old hardwood floors, the grain familiar underfoot. The air held the scent of paper and coffee grounds, her kind of comfort. No photos lined the hallway walls, just books, case law, biographies. A framed letter from the Innocence Project sat beside a ceramic dish filled with old cufflinks she no longer wore. She placed her bag on the side table next to the untouched stack of mail. From her coat pocket, she removed the envelope Rachel had given her at the wedding. The photo inside the edited one was now smoothed from where her thumb had rested against it on the flight home. She crossed to her desk. It sat in front of a window that overlooked a narrow backyard with a dogwood tree she had never had the heart to cut down. Her old judicial pin was no longer there. It had a new home now, pinned to a blazer pocket of a young public defender who hadn't yet learned how strong she was. Danielle placed the photo on the desk, not framed, not displayed, just there. It leaned softly against a stack of yellowed legal pads and a worn paperback of Baldwin essays. A different kind of memory, not forgiveness, not belonging, but presence. A nod to what was and to what had perhaps been quietly amended. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Rachel, one line. You made your point. Stay away. Danielle read it twice, not out of disbelief, but because old wounds sometimes deserve a second glance before they're shelved for good. She placed the phone face down. No reply. No response was needed. The house, like her silence, had learned to hold more than just absence. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled out an old accordion file. Its corners were frayed, the tab handwritten in smudged ink, client letters. Personal. She sat down on the leather armchair near the window. The same one Justice Carter had once visited, resting her cane gently against the armrest while telling Danielle not to let a courtroom harden her smile. Danielle opened the file. One by one, she unfolded letters written in shaky hands, printed emails, children's drawings with misspelled thank yous, even one handwritten card from a woman she'd ruled against. Thank you for your fairness, even when it hurt. Each letter was a memory stitched with truth. Not always gratitude, but always respect. They were records, not the kind her mother valued, not the polished versions that got mounted in homes with pearl brooches and matching wine glasses, but the kind that mattered. The kind that said, I saw you. And more importantly, you saw me. A wind moved through the dogwood outside. Its branches shifted gently like it was brushing something off its shoulders. Danielle set the folder down and let the silence stretch. Not the silence of absence, but of stillness, of after. She didn't think about the photo on the desk. She didn't dwell on Rachel's text. She didn't search the faces of her family and old memories, trying to make sense of why their love had come with conditions she could never meet. She was no longer waiting to be let back in. She had outgrown the need for reunion. Reunion implied returning to something once whole. But Danielle had never felt whole in their presence, only shaped, polished, posed. The version of her that was invited to dinner parties and holiday brunches had never been the one who sat through victim testimony until her hands trembled. It had never been the woman who stayed after court hours to explain eviction timelines to terrified mothers. It had never been the girl who said no when it was easiest to say nothing. No, that version wasn't real. This one was. And this version had already been seen by clients, by students, by James Green, by the young woman clutching her judicial pin like a relic, even by Rachel in whatever conflicted way her broken gesture of a photo had tried to say. Danielle stood and returned the folder to the shelf. She poured herself a cup of tea, not coffee this time, mint, something softer. As the steam rose curling like a question left unanswered, she walked back to the desk. The light was fading now, the window pane catching the blush of the sky. The photo stayed, not because it meant everything, but because it meant something. A comma, not a period. Danielle sipped her tea and let the warmth settle into her. Not lonely, just still. The way silence feels when it no longer tries to explain itself. She looked out at the tree and the fading light and thought about the things she had once begged to keep. Family, inclusion, recognition. She no longer needed them. She had her records. She had her rulings. She had her name written, not on invitations or name cards, but in the decisions that would outlive them all. She had already been seen. She had chosen peace, not by walking away, but by standing exactly where she was. She closed her eyes and let it land. And then, like a final sentence placed without flourish, the thought came as calm as breath. Sometimes being forgotten is just another way to be freed.